Let me begin. Good afternoon, and thanks to all for joining this IEO webinar on the economic weapon, the rise of sanctions, the tool of modern war. Let me remind you that, as usual, as you've heard, we're recording today's event, and we shall post the recording on the IEO website in the next 48 hours or so. This webinar is, of course, timely in a moment in history when NATO countries press ahead against Russia with some of the most wide-ranging sanctions to be deployed since the start of the 20th century. Globally, many, including, of course, the IMF, are trying to understand the implications of these sanctions, not just for the war, but also for the global economy. During last webinar with Esfandyar Batmanghelidj of GoMoney, we explored the thesis by Zoltan Pozsar at Credit Suisse that the current sanctions may have paved the way to Bretton Woods III, a new world monetary order centered around commodity-based currencies in the East that will likely weaken the euro-dollar system and also contribute to inflationary forces in the West. Today, we will focus on current events by taking a journey in the history of sanctions, the so-called economic weapon. Talking about this tool, in 1919, US President Woodrow Wilson defined them as something more tremendous than war. This tool became part of the war and peace arsenal of a group of countries, notably those adhering to the League of Nations. And we will look at whether evidence supports the idea that sanctions can be useful and effective to accelerate peace or deter war, or rather have could have potentially long-lasting destabilizing effect on world peace, especially when, like today, sanctions are directed at a large industrial country which dominates so many commodity markets like Russia. Additional questions we will try to answer include what medium-term effects do sanctions have on the country being targeted, and what humanitarian and other ripple effects might they have on other countries and economies. How do sanctions affect the operations of the international financial institutions like the IMF in response to other shocks, global shocks like COVID-19? And what economic policies can be enacted to minimize the risk that, like in 1920s or 1930s, today's large-scale economic blockades might destabilize the international system rather than fortifying it? I chose phenomenal speakers to help us navigate this topic. The first is economic historian Nicholas Mulder. Nicholas is assistant professor of modern European history at Cornell University and works on European and international history from the 19th century to the present. He's a regular contributor to Foreign Policy and The Nation. His slides will draw heavily from his book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, appeared in January 2022 with Yale University Press. The book chronicles the genesis and evolutions of sanctions since World War I and their more recent morphing into a highly sophisticated levers of influence. And it discusses why sanctions have tended to be largely ineffective in the past, while they have indeed shaped the global economy and affected the world order in multiple ways. Our second speaker is sanctions impact expert Esfandyar Batmanghelidj of Bourse Bazaar Foundation. Esfandyar is the founder and CEO of the Bourse Bazaar Foundation, a think tank dedicated to economic diplomacy, economic development, and economic justice in the Middle East and Central Asia. He has published extensively on sanctions with a focus on economic adaptations and humanitarian impacts in targeted countries. He's a contributor to the Sanctions and Security Research Project and a member of the SNIS-funded project entitled When Money Can Buy Food and Medicine. It's time now to invite Professor Mulder to the microphone. Nicholas, please, the floor is yours. You can share your slides now.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta, for that introduction, and I will go ahead and share my slides. So thanks everyone for coming today, and I'm very happy to be able to talk to this audience about my book, but more importantly, I think about what some of the lessons of the history of sanctions are for the situation that we confront in the world today, when a very large-scale use of sanctions is visibly having serious and important effects on the world economy. This book came out in January, as Nicoletta mentioned, and it was really written as a history book first and foremost. But one of the interesting things is that the interwar period does have a number of relevant similarities to the present. And as an economic historian, there's also certain useful ways that we can compare it using data, using a focus on international institutions, the movement of trade and finance, and these sorts of things. So I'll be drawing on that in this presentation. I want to start with a discussion of the origins of sanctions, where sanctions really originated as a policy instrument in the international system. And that's at the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in the period during and after the First World War, when the use of economic blockade was repurposed and reframed as a peacetime instrument. And that is really the origin point for modern economic sanctions. I'll then talk a little bit about the main organization that used economic sanctions in this period, the League of Nations, and the model for how its sanctions were supposed to operate, which was as a deterrent. I'll then move on to discussing the 1930s and the Great Depression. And the reason why that is interesting is because, of course, in the present, we are also in a moment in which there are great stresses in the world economy for several years now, ever since the 2008 global financial crisis, a number of debt crises since then, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, and now the Russo-Ukrainian war that broke out in February. A number of strains have entered our global economy. They are interacting with each other. We're dealing with the legacies of these past shocks, even as we're confronting the new ones. And that actually is a situation that is quite similar to what was going on in the 1930s, when sanctions were also used in a crisis moment in globalization. I'll then mention what I think is a very illustrative and useful tool that was developed but not fully brought to fruition in this period, which is the so-called positive economic weapon. Sanctions were referred to in the early 20th century as an economic weapon, but particularly as a negative one. But there was an alternative. There was also an instrument that ran in parallel with this, and this was the provision of large-scale finance and aid to the victims of wars and invasions, and also, more broadly speaking, the use of financial instruments in order to offset some of the damage to the world economy caused by economic restrictions and blockades. And I think that that would be very useful to think about what such a positive economic weapon would look like today. And that's what we'll focus on in the final section, some comparisons and contrasts between the 1930s and now. So let's start with the early 20th century and the origins of sanctions. And to do that, we must go back to 1914, when the First World War broke out, also known as the Great War. At that time, still, of course, referred as the World War before there was a second one. And the remarkable thing about this conflict was that it erupted in a world that was already remarkably globalized in economic and financial terms. A large degree of cross-border interactions and transactions were happening on a continuous basis, and particularly in Europe, where the richest economies in the world at that time were located. Europe in 1914 together controlled roughly half of world GDP, so it really was the dominant economic bloc in the economy. And this is precisely where the First World War broke out. When it did so, economic considerations were not far from the minds of policymakers. And one of the main ways in which they tried to use this position in the world economy was to exploit the interdependence of this world economy against their opponents. In the map on the left, you can see in the dark colors the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, later on joined by the Ottoman Empire. And their opponents, the Entente, included Great Britain, France, and Russia, and after that, a number of other countries. But these were the initial blocs that were fighting each other. And Great Britain and France in particular took the lead in mobilizing economic levers against Germany and Austria-Hungary, isolating them from the rest of the world economy, trying to sever their access to trade, first through a naval blockade, but increasingly it became clear that there were other measures that were needed. There were several countries, for example, that were neutral in this war: Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, among others. And these countries continued to be conduits for trade. So as Britain and France tried to expand this economic war, they also had to increase the number of interventions to try and keep the Central Powers from accessing the rest of the world economy. And they had to go into these neutral markets and try and prevent them from being used as conduits. This required the expansion of bureaucracies, and both Britain and France ended the First World War having fully independent ministries in charge of this blockade. So this was such an important policy tool, it became its own separate government department, independent of the foreign offices even. A very large number of civil servants in the thousands working in both London and Paris to keep this economic blockade going and to expand it ever more into new domains, into the realm of shipping, into the realm of energy control. In this case, that was coal, which was the predominant form of fuel used in the early 20th century, and also in the realm of finance. So trying to find financial transactions from the rest of the world that entered Germany and Austria-Hungary, and trying to stop banks in neutral countries particularly from transmitting these payments. So this was a project of bureaucratic construction, a project in which new tools of intervention, of surveillance, statistics and information gathering were developed. And by the end of the war, a quite severe amount of economic pressure was indeed brought to bear on the Central Powers. And this led the Allied policymakers that won the First World War to think that they could use these sorts of techniques in the future, potentially even to avoid a repetition of the World War altogether. So to use these techniques of economic war, but continue their use in peacetime with an eye to preventing war and making sure that countries that would embark on aggressive war would be prevented from doing so, because from the moment they would do so, they would be faced with a very severe economic and financial blockade. And this is really the origin point where blockade turns into sanctions, where a wartime tool becomes a peacetime instrument. And the first organization to have this power was the organization created by the victors of the First World War, the League of Nations. In Article 16 of its covenant, which was drafted in 1919, the League, which also included a very large group of the world's states at that time, and particularly because the large European states at this time had colonial empires, so this also included a large part of Africa and Asia. The League had the power to impose economic and financial sanctions on countries that were deemed by its council to have committed an act of aggression. So to have violated the territorial integrity of a member state or to have infringed on national sovereignty. And this was the negative side of this economic weapon, a sanctions procedure in which all League member states were required to join. At the same time, Article 16, in its final paragraph, also said something about other economic tools that had to be brought to bear, particularly financial and logistical aid to the victims of such an invasion. This was relatively underdeveloped, and I'll return to this point later on, but it was an important point because it came out of the inter-allied logistical cooperation during the First World War, the sharing of resources among allies, and not only the depriving of opponents of resources. And this became a major policy challenge in the 1920s and 30s. How could an international organization impose these sanctions? Well, it turned out that they required large degrees of coordination between national policymakers and international institutions, particularly the permanent organs of the League, which were based in Geneva in Switzerland. In Britain and France, the major member states with large navies, large bureaucracies, it was national policymakers who took the lead in trying to develop a permanent peacetime sanctions capacity. But in the League of Nations itself also, there was a branch of its economic and financial organization, the EFO, in many ways the forerunner, of course, of the IMF in the interwar period, that also devoted itself to studying the possible application and the possible effects of sanctions. And interestingly, a dispute already emerged at this time between the national policymakers and the EFO officials about how the international system should be prepared for the use of sanctions. Statistics were clearly vital. If one wanted to use sanctions against countries, it was necessary to map the way in which they were actually interacting and connected to other countries and economies. Trade statistics were vital, but also information and data on financial flows, on cross-border movements of all kinds. And these statistics were increasingly being gathered in the early 20th century, but they were still very much an ongoing process. And the League of Nations and the EFO saw it as their responsibility to provide this information for post-World War I reconstruction, for the better of the international community and the global economy as a whole. Britain and France, on the other hand, wanted to use this information also for an economic purpose, but particularly also to prepare sanctions. They wanted to be able to know, for example, how much trade Germany was really conducting with the Soviet Union, how many goods were moving in and out of Turkey from surrounding Middle Eastern countries, these sorts of questions. And this led to friction because the EFO, as a multilateral institution, and Britain and France, as countries that were pursuing also security objectives, were essentially fighting over what to do with the statistical information. Now, Article 16, interestingly, relied on the League of Nations Council, and it would already be publicly discussed in cases where a border incident, for example, led to a potential warlike situation. And it was usually in these sorts of situations that sanctions were actually used as a threat rather than being actually applied. And this indeed led to some successes in the 1920s, particularly against smaller economies. The first time sanctions were successfully used as a deterrent was in late 1921, when Yugoslavia was engaged in a covert military incursion into northern Albania. The League of Nations Council convened, began to discuss sanctions procedures, and there was a very overt threat of using this kind of procedure against Yugoslavia. Very quickly, the value of the Yugoslav dinar fell on financial markets in the city of London, and soon the government in Belgrade yielded and withdrew its troops, and an international commission fixed the border, and this conflict was resolved relatively quickly within a matter of weeks. This, of course, gave great grounds for optimism to the supporters of sanctions in the League. And a few years later, in the fall of 1925, they again managed to use the mere threat of sanctions to diffuse a conflict, this time involving Greece and Bulgaria. You can see here a picture of the Greek dictator Theodoros Pangalos, who'd come to power in a military coup, and he became embroiled in the fall of 1925 in a border skirmish with Bulgaria. The League again openly discussed imposing an economic and financial blockade on Greece, and Pangalos changed his course of action and allowed the League to mediate a solution. And a final, quite interesting case in which sanctions were used very lightly and clearly were used in a way to indicate a larger threat that was kept in reserve was in 1940, when the United States temporarily severed the oil supply of Spain. Spain at that time, under Francisco Franco, was a neutral country, and it was deciding about whether to enter the Second World War on the side of the Axis with Hitler or whether to remain neutral. And at that moment, the United States stopped 6 oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. It was at the time a very large oil exporter. Franco realized that he would not be able to continue any kind of military involvement in the war without that oil, and he decided that he was going to stay neutral. And so very quickly, oil supplies were restarted. This only involved a few ships, but it was a very powerful demonstration of the fact that more was being kept in store, and indeed it kept Spain out of the war for the remainder of the 1940s. So against small and medium-sized economies, sanctions could work either when used as a deterrent or when really lightly used and then quickly lifted. So results were quick as well, and overall the damage to the world economy, of course, done by these sanctions episodes was relatively minor. But this changed in the 1930s when the Great Depression took place. There was an overall rise in economic nationalism and also an increasing number of security crises around the world. A major episode which occurred in the mid-1930s and which saw the use of sanctions by the entire League of Nations was the Italo-Ethiopian War. In the fall of 1935, the League of Nations, 52 countries altogether, imposed economic sanctions, for the first time triggered a full Article 16 procedure against Italy, which under Mussolini had invaded another League member state, Ethiopia. These sanctions included an arms embargo, a ban on financial transactions, restrictions on a number of commodities being sent to Italy, and crucially, an embargo on buying any kind of Italian exports. So effectively, Italy saw its export revenues from exporting to League member states severely diminished. However, they didn't work quickly enough to stop the Italian war machine, and within the space of about 8 months, the Italian army conquered Ethiopia, and fairly shortly after, the sanctions were lifted. This failure of sanctions to work, however, didn't mean that these sanctions didn't have effects, and they're often seen as proof that the League was relatively inefficacious. But actually, when one looks at the wider effects, this did show, in the eyes of other states that had designs for territorial revision, that the League did have a very serious economic pressure instrument at its disposal. And one country that saw this as a sign that it should increasingly move towards autarky and full economic self-sufficiency was Nazi Germany. The Nazis had already tried to move towards more economic self-reliance in the years before that, but the Italo-Ethiopian War and the League use of sanctions accelerated their drive, and relatively soon after the sanctions were imposed by the League, they launched the so-called four-year plan, in which they tried to secure supplies so that, unlike in the First World War, when they were still exposed to blockade and unable to really maintain a lot of economic resilience, they now hoped not only to become self-sufficient in production of fuel, but also to be able to draw crucial inputs from a number of allied economies all over East and Central Europe. And so you can see here on the right two pictures in German language publications distributed in the United States, boasting.
اون کتاب چاپ شده دیگه
Sorry, someone with the mic on. Hi, could you shut down your mic? A sec. Sorry about that. I could control it, but I couldn't find the person. Okay, sorry.
No problem. You can see here on the right two pictures comparing Germany's vulnerability to economic blockade in the First World War compared to the Second World War. So by the end of the 1940s, the four-year plan had given them the confidence that they were now able to be effectively sanctions-proof against the League. And this, of course, set the stage for their wars of conquest. It was a very unstable dynamic because they continued to be very fearful of being blockaded. And as a result, their ambitions for territorial conquest became larger and larger. The amounts of resources needed to power this sort of a territorial zone steadily grew. And in a sense, we can identify in the 1930s an escalatory spiral between sanctions and the desire for autarky and territorial aggression, which leads to further sanctions and sanctions threats, which only further increase the desire of some of these states for more territorial conquest. And finally, one of the most dramatic forms in which sanctions backfired was against Japan in the late 1930s. That was the seventh largest economy in the world. Just for comparison, I've added also Italy was the eighth largest economy in the 1930s, and Nazi Germany the third largest economy. So these were sanctions in the top 10 of global economies, really at a quite significant scale macroeconomically, even if they began oftentimes with small measures and steadily built up to larger ones. Against Japan, from 1939 onward, also Western states began to impose sanctions. Japan was already engaged in a war with China at that time. And by 1940, 1941, Japan saw itself increasingly pushed out of trading relations with a number of countries, particularly the British Empire and its dominions and colonies. So India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, which had been important trading partners around the Pacific, no longer traded with Japan. And Japan became almost entirely reliant on their last remaining neutral economy in the world, the United States. And you can see at the bottom left here in the gray part of the bar is trade with the United States, which became really the dominant share of Japanese imports. This meant that by the summer of 1941, Japan was almost entirely reliant on the United States for oil imports, but also iron ore, scrap metal, and various other essential raw materials, nickel and copper. And when the United States then moved on to an asset freeze and an oil embargo, this prompted Japan to attack several months later across the Pacific, including at Pearl Harbor, and conquer large parts of Southeast Asia to secure these resources that it could no longer obtain through trade. So this was a really final episode which showed dramatically the potential for sanctions to backfire when they were used in a context of geopolitical tension and against countries who saw access to resources as an existential issue for them. I already mentioned that there was another tool that was not used as much in the interwar period, the positive economic weapon. And the idea initially had been born of the experience of policymakers in the First World War, that it was possible to use instruments such as loans, but also aid and logistical supplies, the pooling of ships, for example, shipping tonnage, and all sorts of raw materials and commodities from grain to metals in order to pool resources and to balance out some of the negative effects caused by sanctions and blockade as an instrument of deprivation. Interestingly, John Maynard Keynes was also involved in providing feedback and debating with League of Nations officials in the EFO how such an instrument should be designed. And already in 1924, we can find him here writing that he said, I believe that such positive measures would be much more impressive when the time came than negative acts, by which he means sanctions or blockade like instruments, which would always run the risk, one, of not being efficacious, and two, of not being easily distinguished from acts of war. My feeling is that the more these things are thought about, the more we shall be inclined to depend upon positive assistance to the injured party as compared with reprisals against the aggressor. Well, this is a very lucid statement by Keynes, and it's very interesting that he was involved in the 1920s together with several financiers in the City of London in trying to turn this into a concrete instrument, a mechanism that could be used by countries that saw themselves at the receiving end of invasions or war. This was known as the Convention on Financial Assistance. It was drafted by the League of Nations, and it envisioned large, powerful countries in the League acting as guarantors for smaller countries borrowing on international markets in order to provide for their own defense. And it came together, it was actually signed by a number of countries, this convention, a majority of League member states, but it was never ratified and entered into force because by the time that it came up for ratification, the Great Depression had taken place and there was a broad turn towards budgetary and fiscal orthodoxy, and countries were not inclined to sign on to conventions that actually made them liable for even more expenditures. So the positive financial assistance weapon was effectively stillborn in the interwar period. However, it did make a comeback belatedly during the Second World War, when, of course, there was again economic warfare and blockades, but crucially, a much more ambitious economic assistance program to not only countries under attack, but any country willing to fight on the sides of the Allies in the form of Lend-Lease, the Lend-Lease aid program. About $50 billion in 1940s dollars, so that today is equal to almost $1 trillion at current dollar values. Lend-Lease really provided a massive stimulus in terms of goods, but also raw materials and services provision from the United States to the rest of the world economy. And you can see at the bottom left here some of the recipient countries. By the end of the war, Lend-Lease here on the picture, you can see Lend-Lease convoys passing through Iran on their way to the Soviet Union. A stark contrast, of course, with the use of economic sanctions against Iran in recent decades. Lend-Lease really built the material foundations for post-World War II reconstruction. It was far larger in scale than the Marshall Plan. And if we're looking for why the United Nations had such material legitimacy, it's largely because it had very solid foundations in the form of Lend-Lease. So that brings me to a few comparisons and contrasts between this history of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and the situation that we confront today. Clearly, the current large-scale economic sanctions, not just in the scale of the sanctions, but in the size of the target against Russia, are really unseen in scale and in severity since the 1930s. So we are in many ways in a new situation that certainly since the creation of the IMF and the Bretton Woods system, we haven't really seen this. But there are also some important differences, of course, in this situation politically and strategically. One important aspect of the current sanctions is that Russia, of course, is a major commodity exporter. This means that it is self-sufficient in food and in crucial energy forms of energy, which makes it quite different from these economies like Japan, Italy, and Germany that were targeted by sanctions in the 30s. As a result, I would rate the risk of military escalation probably somewhat lower as a result of the sanctions, simply because these sanctions, while very damaging to Russia, are not in the same way an existential danger to a Russian society. That being said, there is, however, a serious economic escalation risk and an economic spillover effect of these sanctions. And that has to do with a very simple difference between the interwar period and today, which is that today there is a much higher degree of economic interdependence still and much higher trade to GDP ratio. So if you look at, for example, merchandise exports here as a rough proxy, we are now in really a different level qualitatively in the world economy in terms of interdependence and trade. When sanctions are used in this kind of context, the spillover effects and the negative ancillary and unintended consequences are severe. So militarily, I think the escalation risk is lower. Economically, I think the spillover effects we're already seeing are much more severe than in the 1930s. And one other important lesson from the 1930s is that sanctions always interact with the economic conjuncture in the world economy of the given moments in which they're used. So the specific timing either can enhance the effects or can weaken them. And in this moment, I think we're in a particularly fraught situation because of pre-existing problems and legacies of previous shocks. There's pandemic-caused disruptions, of course, lockdowns in China and elsewhere, supply chain fragilities that were exposed during the recovery from the pandemic, but have also, I think, something to do with a long-term underinvestment in crucial infrastructures in advanced economies. There's also, at the moment, of course, a global tightening cycle, monetarily and financially, which has led the global financial cycle to revert out of emerging markets and back into advanced economies. And this has, I think, created serious problems in the realms of balance of payments and debt for emerging markets and developing economies. All of this pre-existing situation makes sanctions on the 11th largest economy in the world tantamount to a major macroeconomic shock. We can unpack that a little bit more. There's, of course, a commodity price shock because Russia is a large commodity exporter, but there are also additional effects. And here I would identify the private sector response to the sanctions. Some people have called this self-sanctioning. But what's key about it is that the private sector withdrawal from Russia and the refusal to engage in certain transactions and trades that are even remotely tied to Russia by many firms, banks, exporters, merchants around the world is aggravating and amplifying the sanctions shock. This is going over and above what the law of many sanctions regulations requires. And it means, therefore, that the macroeconomic effect of the sanctions cannot be deduced from the formal restrictions that governments have imposed. It's creating ripple effects throughout the private sector through fears of future sanctions and compliance risks. On top of that, there are a number of effects that we might call sanctions hysteresis, that as a result of this private sector, in a sense, overreaction to sanctions, we're unlikely to see as big an economic recovery, even if the sanctions were lifted, because the private sector will continue to have doubts, fears, uncertainties about the future global economic environment, even if these sanctions were quickly lifted again. So I think we could speak in Keynesian terms also of a negative multiplier effect caused by the corporate withdrawal and the private sector disengagement from Russia, and from, more broadly speaking, the commodity trade tied to Russia. This means that in the short term, the global GDP and trade effects of the sanctions are likely overshooting the scope of official government restrictions, as I mentioned. In the medium term, and I hope that Esfandyar will be able to shed more light on this because of his research into the experience of, for example, Iran, we will probably see adjustment, both in the sanctions imposing economies as they find alternate sources of energy that they're now reliant on Russia for, but also in target economies, Russia itself, as some measure of trade diversion sets in. And we still have to see how big that trade diversion will be. In certain sectors, there's much more room for it than in others. Finally, however, I think that long run, there is hardly any doubt that these sanctions will be damaging to the world economy, not just in terms of missed growth, for Russia, economies tied to it, and more broadly speaking, the diversion and the opportunity and time spent finding other trade partners, but also the living standards in a number of emerging market and developing economies that are now hit by much higher import bills for food and energy prices. And then, as I mentioned, the hysteresis effect of foreign investors fearing reinvestment, even if we can imagine a future in which potentially these sanctions were to be lifted. So this is a long-term policy challenge. Finally, I just want to close on this note, asking what might a positive economic instrument, a positive economic weapon, if you will, for today look like, and what kinds of constructive policies can we imagine to offset the damage that sanctions are doing to the world economy? Now, I could think of a few, and this graph also that I just showed of trade and GDP, all of these suggestions are also in an upcoming finance and development essay that is forthcoming. I think first, we could think of advanced economies doing more on the supply side in terms of investing in infrastructure. That will ease some of the supply chain bottlenecks and inflationary pressures that we're witnessing right now. For emerging markets and developing economies, I actually think the challenge is different. It's particularly demand side support, because incomes there are squeezed much harder. There's less fiscal space, and the situation in many regards is much more dire. One concrete thing that can be done, of course, and from what I gathered, there is already an SDR, a new SDR release and adjustment in the works that should be forthcoming soon. If it hasn't happened already, I may have missed it. But I think the priority there clearly is that emerging market and developing economies should be able to weather balance of payments and debt crises while these sanctions are absorbed by the world economy and the adjustment kicks in. And then finally, in the realm of concrete policy measures, we are now in a tightening cycle. Many of the interest rate hiking discourse is about how demand will have to be destroyed if we want to bring down inflationary pressures on prices. I think that this is a rather blunt approach. And moreover, it also doesn't solve the problem. Hiking interest rates will not expand port capacity or give us a way to effectively allocate the very limited supplies of, for example, liquefied natural gas. If there will be an EU gas embargo, an embargo on importing gas from Russia, Europe, for example, will be forced to rely on imports of liquefied natural gas from the United States, Qatar, and other countries, but it will have to outbid Asian consumers of LNG. It seems that rather than using interest rates and other forms of tools to try and keep the LNG price down, what needs to happen is a demand-side coordination through diplomacy and international allocation of demand. How can we organize demand more effectively to make sure that there isn't this upward bidding and all countries can continue to consume some essential forms of energy and food at a fair price without driving up prices for all of them? Humanitarian aid channels are, of course, vital, particularly in food and medicine. And that's something that previous sanctions regimes have also showed. But I think this sort of combination of measures is what we need to think about. And finally, of course, reconstruction for Ukraine, which is really severely hit by this war, is vital. But also, again, given its interdependence with the rest of the world and its role in commodities exports, if there can be a kind of peace deal and a possible sanctions lifting against Russia, however far in the future that may be, support for the Russian economy, which also has undergone a severe shock and will probably be in need of some kind of assistance. And the final thought that I want to leave you with is that when we look at these large-scale sanctions, they are a form of economic war. So what we probably need to think of in terms of what the world economy and individual economies need after sanctions is that they are in a kind of post-war setting, a reconstruction setting. And in that realm, aid and finance and these sorts of measures will be important going forward. Thanks very much. And I look forward to Yar and to your questions.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. This was, of course, extremely illuminating. And thank you so much also for bringing it home on the current conjuncture and what it means for what we can do at the current moment, which of course is everybody's question, and it's top of mind. I would like to pass the stage now to Esfandyar, who I think also has some slides, and asked him specifically to focus on what are the implications for international financial institutions of what's going on, and what can people in these organizations do about, alleviating and mitigating the economic consequences of what's going on. So Esfandyar, the floor is yours. Thank you. And I see the slides up already.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to follow Nick in this discussion. I have benefited enormously from our dialogue over the last few years and really learned a lot from him and certainly from his excellent book. So Nick ended by talking about things that could be done in the realm of the positive economic weapon, and I'm going to talk about things that must be done and maybe suggest that for IFIs there are some imperatives when we look at the impact of sanctions in reshaping the global economy, this idea that sanctions are a global macroeconomic shock. And we have to question whether there's a stabilization role to be played by IFIs. So the idea is that we need to retool IFIs in order to more nimbly navigate in a world shaped by sanctions. I think we've seen a number of instances in which IFIs have been prevented from acting in formerly sanctioned countries where they have struggled to provide facilities to countries that are under sanctions programs that those countries might be qualified to benefit from. And so it suggests that development banks and other financial institutions need greater compliance and regulatory functions and sanction-specific economic and operational expertise. Now, of course, as this audience knows, there are complicated politics about multilateral financial institutions engaging on sanctions-related cases that may themselves be multilateral sanctions programs. And so one of the things I would also suggest is that when we think about retooling IFIs, we might also think about a dedicated financial institution with a specific mission and mandate to provide some of the positive economic weapon functions that Nick talked about, but in this environment where sanctions are going to be an ever-present reality of the economic system. So what are the 5 imperatives of why we would need to go through this kind of retooling process? Well, the first is this idea of preserving the global economy. And there's been some excellent writing on this. Nick has an essay in The Economist. Adam Posen of the Peterson Institute has written a great essay in Foreign Affairs. There is this suggestion that the increased use of sanctions, and particularly the sanctions on Russia, may lead to some questions about the durability of the liberal economic order as it has existed. And to the extent that IFIs have helped build that order, there's an argument that they ought to proactively defend that order. So for example, the demand management or the investments on the supply side that Nick talked about are ways that we can make clear for economies that are in earlier stages of their development that remaining connected to the global economy remains a pathway to growth. And so that's somewhere where I think IFIs could have a huge impact. But looking beyond the macro picture, there's also this idea of protecting investments. And I was sort of spurred to this because I've recently spent several weeks in Uzbekistan, which is a country where I work. And there has been an enormous investment since 2016 by the World Bank, ADB, EBRD in Uzbekistan, billions of dollars. And Uzbekistan has the misfortune of now being surrounded by Afghanistan under a sanctions program because of the Taliban, Iran under a sanctions program because of the stall in the nuclear negotiations, and Russia under a sanctions program because of the invasion of Ukraine. And there are real questions about whether some of the development goals that were set out in the financing provided to Uzbek government institutions and companies to engage in certain kinds of export-oriented activities make sense in a situation where you have very constrained access to global markets because of the impact of sanctions on logistics networks. And so an intervention there of new investment, of re-strategizing around the financing that's being provided might be necessary to make sure that the billions spent to date in many middle-income countries isn't lost in terms of basically growth hitting a wall. The third argument here is a little bit of a subtle one, but I think it's important. Someone is going to have to pay for IFIs to increase their engagement around these issues. So who is funding the positive economic weapon? And I think here there's a strong argument that the countries that are the wealthier countries and happen to be the countries that impose sanctions most frequently, so Europe and the US, should foot the bill for this positive economic weapon. And this is actually a powerful way for the externality, the unintended consequences of sanctions to be internalized so that we no longer are in a situation where Western policymakers simply perceive sanctions as a costless tool that can be applied with little regard for these unintended impacts like the exogenous shock on different economies, because they don't have to foot the bill in any way. But if there are mechanisms where through these types of financial institutions, there is funding provided and that is dispersed, it is maybe one way to internalize that externality and then B, start to constrain the kind of freewheeling use of sanctions that we should be concerned about. The fourth point, which Nick also mentioned, and this is something that we highlighted in an article in 2019, was this idea of reconstruction. And so at the time in 2019, we were writing in part about cases like Iran, where the lifting of sanctions did not lead to significant financing and foreign investment inflows. And that actually compromised the durability of the agreement that underpinned the sanctions relief. And so there's a strong argument here that if IFIs are able to step in and bridge that gap, working in formally sanctioned economies, you can actually end up in a situation where sanctions are seen as more effective because the relief, the promise of relief, is more credible. In addition, the IFIs can step in and support situations where I think reparations and reconstruction need to be connected. So Nick just mentioned the idea that Ukraine sanctions, that IFIs, or the positive economic weapon, I should say, can be used as a way to conceptualize financial support for Ukraine after the war. One way to also think about this is to the extent that countries will need to benefit from economic inflows when sanctions are lifted. If Russia needs to, for example, repair its economy after it's been under sanctions, but we also have an expectation that Russia would provide some kind of reparations for Ukraine, one concept is that those reparations are actually something that's financed through an international financial institution, so that Ukraine gets an immediate financial uplift in the form of a reparations package, but that cost is amortized over a longer period so that it doesn't impede Russia's ability to economically recover in a situation where they have taken the steps to warrant sanctions relief. And then finally, and this is more of a big picture point, but crucially important, is that part of the thing that's destabilizing about this and concerning about the idea that there may be these emergent economic blocks is that it raises serious questions about the ability to coordinate global actors on major issues like climate change or in the face of major challenges like pandemics. And so one of the things that I think we ought to consider is whether IFIs can be relatively neutral, financially capable, and well-positioned institutions to continue to coordinate those areas where investments and engagement need to continue regardless of sanctions programs. So for example, areas like public health and reducing global emissions and trying to protect the environment. And so I think even with this longer term view and this view of global crises, there is a major role to be played. So to conclude, I think Nick's history is really a powerful way of thinking about current challenges that we face that isn't as inherently, that doesn't trigger a lot of the political apprehensions that we have. And so I think this idea of the positive economic weapon that comes out of his case history is a really critical tool for us to be considering. And I really can't imagine, and I don't see any other institutions other than global development banks and institutions like the IMF that are in a position to try and bring those tools into the toolkit of policymakers in a real way. So I hope that was some food for thought, but thank you again for having me.
Esfandyar, thank you for very thoughtful remarks and the possible implications and the imperatives, you call them imperatives for IFIs. I think it's, you set an agenda that is both ambitious and bold, but very much necessary. I see myself in the wake of what might come, even after the lifting of the existing sanctions, which, by the way, as you pointed out, they're not just happening in Russia, but in a number of other countries. Whatever these countries might do or not do, and whatever the reason why the sanctions have been extended, there are tangible consequences for the rest of the world. There are boomerang effects on the same sanctionaires, so the countries that are applying those sanctions. And there, as history indicates, and very well narrated in Nicholas' book, there are serious possibilities that risks may arise of political fragmentation but also changes to the economic order. I just wanted to read a passage here, and then I have a question for Nick. I've asked people to jot down their questions in the chat as I speak, but there was this passage that as I was reading chapter on the greatest experiment in modern history, which is the Ethiopia War. From your book, Nicholas, it says, attritional sanctions did not prevent the conquest of Ethiopia, but they seriously deformed the Italian economy, forcing difficult choices on the fascist regime and shaping the autarkic orientation of German and Japanese elites as well. After 1935, the states mobilized themselves on a wartime footing and fought and funded conflicts in Spain and China in an increasingly desperate effort to escape their material vulnerabilities. I think this goes at the point that you made very clearly during your presentation. Now, my question, Nick, is you have ranked the risk of territorial revision in the case of, the sanctions from NATO to Russia as low because of the independence of Russia from the need of, outside suppliers of commodities, particularly energy and, of course, food, which are, the two basic kind of commodities that countries need to secure to continue to exist. But what's your view of the risk of sanctions in the light of what I just read, of leading to a reconfiguration of the world order, not just being high, but it seems to be already practically underway, and there's a new. It's not just a diversion of trade, but it's a much larger, phenomenon that seems to already even having to be embraced economically by the U.S. and the declarations by Janet Yellen at the Atlantic Council on, the renouncing to a global world economy and going more towards a pluralist view, which picks some countries out of all and sort of almost partitions the world into, blocks. What would you make of that as a risk? And then, what would be the solution to avoid that? Of course, peace negotiations, I think that would be the answer, but.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. No, I think that this risk that you outline of block formation in economics, in political alignments, and in international institutions is really serious. And just yesterday, also in the WTO, now the discussions about vaccine patent waivers, right, show that this is not only about these territorial disputes and wars, but it starts to because there's a new paradigm of geoeconomics, and where potentially every economic sector can be considered vital to national security, all sorts of realms of the world economy hitherto considered not really bound up with that are now being drawn into it. So this risk of across the board block formation, I think, is real. I don't think we're fully there yet, which is the good news. So there are still lots and lots of places where I think the benefits of interdependence very clearly outweigh the downsides. And if we can make that argument and that case clearly, then I think we not only make sure that there is the material basis for political understanding between people, but also we actually, as long as people keep trading, it is quite difficult to go to war with each other. So I think the real risk of a block formation process is that over time, the costs of actually going to war are reduced because interdependence is also reduced. So it seems like it's a defense, but it actually is something that could make a war much more likely because the costs of military escalation are lowered. In the passage also that you mentioned, I think one of the other issues is, right, with these sanctions, one can see in the response in Russia now that the military campaign continues. Resources for the military are prioritized, so the costs of adjustment are fully borne by the civilian sector. This, again, it doesn't bode well for the future of a society when the civilian sector is squeezed of resources in favor of the military industrial sector. So in that too, they can have these deforming effects on the long run. And I think what things can be done to prevent block formation, crucially, maybe looking for the areas where there is common ground. in whether that is other policy challenges. I would say, you know, pandemic and disease, but of course that is also increasingly politicized. But certainly climate change as a global issue should rank front and center. I think all the policy responses we undertake should be climate conforming or climate goal conforming. Generally speaking, there's a large middle group in the world as well that I think has not picked sides in this conflict, is reluctant to pick sides, putting their needs and the challenges that they face, which are climate issues, which are developmental challenges, front and center, is also a useful way, I think, of addressing this. So avoiding having this be a discussion only between advanced economies and democracies in the West and East Asia, and that the rest of the world and their interests being effectively neglected. So those are some of the things right now that I think are most important to focus on.
Yes. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I have a question for Esfandyar myself, and another one for Nick, but let me read this out. Bernardo Lishinsky had one. Bernard, do you want to ask it yourself, or shall I read it out? Maybe I should read it out. He was asking about economic sanctions to Latin American and Caribbean countries that are on. Would you like to make a quick comment, either one of you, on those to talk about that regional reality? Nick?
Yeah, I think actually one of the reasons why I'm very happy that we're having this discussion and that there is now a strong and growing interest into sanctions at the IMF and the World Bank and other IFIs is because these cases in Latin America, smaller economies, show that sanctions for too long have not really been studied from the macroeconomic viewpoint because the potential spillover effects to the world economy were not considered significant enough, which has allowed regional and national, economic disasters to continue to unfold, basically, because this was always thought of in the bigger global picture, and the problems of those countries were not considered significant enough. I think that that's now changing also, right, because it's clear that in order to offset some of the upward pressure on energy prices, it may be necessary to lift sanctions on Iran and Venezuela or to ease them somewhat. So now it becomes clear that there are real macroeconomic trade-offs at the world level to be made. But yeah, I think one of the things why this moment should be seized is because sanctions always have macroeconomic effects. It's just only now that we think that they're significant enough, and Cuba and Venezuela were not significant enough to sort of move the needle in terms of people's sense of urgency on these issues.
Absolutely. It's kind of brought the spotlight back onto a number of other, I think, situations, which, people hadn't given a lot of thought in terms of global spillovers. Here's a question from Torsten Ehlers. Nicholas, what is the historical experience with the lifting of sanctions? You talked a little bit about that. One issue with recent sanctions, as Esfandyar mentioned, Iran, is that the lifting of sanctions does not necessarily work symmetrically to their imposition. So you brought the examples of, Greece and Italy, and then there was the case of Spain and, of course, Yugoslavia. But what about, more current conjunction? Nick?
Yeah, so I think the key thing today, simply again because of the size of the interdependence through the private sector, commercially and financially, the key thing is the relation between the sanctions imposing governments and the private sector in those countries. Whether there can be coordination between states and businesses in creating the right kind of conditions for re-entry into markets so that sanctions lifting actually translates into an economic recovery, a positive GDP improvement. And if governments simply change the law and expect the private sector to do everything itself, then we have seen that the effects of sanctions lifting are smaller than we like to think. There are, however, cases where sanctions lifting also can go wrong, not only because there is insufficient coordination, but because countries have sort of bottled up problems. So one other case that Esfandyar and I also have written on is Sudan, which in 2018, a year after some of the US sanctions on Sudan were lifted, went into a very serious balance of payments crisis, because all of a sudden in Sudan, it was possible to now import again using US dollars, and a big balance of payments imbalance emerged very quickly that led to inflation, depreciation of the currency, and actually also contributed to the end of Omar al-Bashir's government. So there are some real issues. I think we need to kind of be ready with assistance tools when sanctions are lifted, and we need to have a narrative about how the private sector can and should re-engage with the countries that are now no longer under sanctions.
Good. I have a question from Otter Gorgodze, who is asking whether, to what extent economic warfare could be analyzed by traditional economic tools, and if and he's actually asking you too if someone is doing this.
Sorry?
Let me just mute. I don't know if one of you wants to pick this up.
Well, I'm listening to a webinar when you called.
Someone
Sponsored by
I can try and jump in and try and beat out the conversation that's happening.
Impact on the international monetary order.
I think it's Mr. Fried. Okay, got it. Thank you. So, well, I will say actually there's really great research being done at the IMF and World Bank. So I'm at a conference right now of people who work on sanctions policy, and the question was raised of who should be doing the monitoring and evaluation of sanctions impacts on target countries and indirect impacts on third countries. And one of the takeaways was that some of the best research, and somewhat belatedly, I think, because this is becoming a more significant issue in more cases, is being done by teams at the IMF and World Bank and other IFIs. There are, of course, economists that are looking at this in the academic community, and I think that's also a very positive thing in terms of us getting a more sophisticated understanding of the impacts. I'll say two specific things. One is the ability of the US government and European governments to actually understand what impacts their sanctions are causing on the economies of target countries is very, very minimal. And there's not a lot of institutional attention given to this. There are not a lot of individuals that are tasked with following these effects. And so that should give us an indication about the confidence with which a lot of policies are being made about whether we are really understanding what the spillover effects might be. On the question specifically about elasticities, I wrote something recently, and one thing that I wanted to rate that I'm interested in, and there needs to be more robust research on this, but one consequence of countries being under chronic sanctions programs. Iran has now been under a sanctions program in a significant sense for about 10 years, with a small brief reprieve in the middle. You could look at a country like Cuba that's been under sanctions for much, much longer. Is that you have a long period of underinvestment. And one of the things that I think we need to start to consider is that if you have significant underinvestment in a country for a long time, you not only get a shift of the aggregate supply curve because of the economic contraction related to sanctions, but you have a change in the elasticity of the aggregate supply curve, where I actually think it's harder for countries that have been under sanctions for a long time to bounce back. And this is another reason why I think you do need to have more deliberate interventions. You can't just leave it to the private sector to step in, because what we need to do is address that change in the elasticity of supply. Because if we don't do that, you will have continued impacts on, for example, the price of goods, because output is simply not going to catch up to demand when demand recovers, when, let's say, currency stabilizes, or individuals find themselves in a less they find themselves employed again when an economic recovery starts to take shape. So these are some of the things that I'm looking at, other people are looking at, but we are at just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the types of economic analysis we should be doing in these cases.
I mean, of course, my reaction to this and some of the suggestions made by Nick and by yourself, Esfandyar, on the solutions in terms of the positive acts that also domestic countries, but also IFIs can take, is to extend credit or, build things, but work on demand. But all of these are inflationary. So in the current world, really shooting in our foot here in terms of, in a world of scarce resources, both because of structural trends and climate change and, the erosion of the global resource endowment, but also particularly this war, which basically translates into these sanctions for the rest of the world. It seems that a lot of these things that were used in the past, which led to drops in prices, are now just going to create, bouts of prices. And so it's really a conundrum from an economic point of view. So it's quite complicated. I would like to, we have a couple more questions. Let's see, we want to hit the 1:45 p.m. here. So on the positive measures, a question from Nadia Rendak. What about debt cancellation and restructuring? I guess they're talking, maybe thinking here about some of the countries we spoke about. It could be another instrument or incentives. Also, do you have a view of unilateral freezes of official reserves? It raises complex issues, including for the IMF. So question is about debt cancellation as one of the measures that's, I think, Nick.
Yeah, I think that would be a measure that definitely needs to be considered in certain cases, or relaxation of the terms, or restructuring of the part of the debt, absolutely, to ease some of the pressure on, particularly in this environment of rising interest rates, where the immediate payments due in the next year and a half are going to create a pretty crushing environment for some developing countries. And on the issue of reserves, one of the things that we've been seeing is that this is not actually a new thing. It's just the first time that a G20 economy has had its reserves frozen, but it was already used against Iran in 1979. Libya in 2011 had about $30 billion in reserves frozen. Venezuela, a smaller amount several years ago in 2018. But this is really on a new scale. Not only official reserves, of course, also many private assets around the world. So the total amount of net foreign capital, net Russian foreign capital, the external is really quite significant. That's affected by these measures. I think it does call into question, from a macroeconomic point of view, what the status of those reserves is, particularly when there are now discussions about moving them into reconstruction for Ukraine. It seems to me that there really needs to be a procedure to determine what the legitimate uses are. In some cases, they are still frozen, these reserves. So let's hope that maybe there can be some sort of restoration, and perhaps this could be an incentive in negotiations, right? To have a tranche by tranche release of those reserves, again, in return for Russian concessions as part of a peace deal. So I understand the argument for leverage. I think when people are going to give in to the increasing calls for outright confiscation, that is quite a dangerous scenario. However, one final other thing is that we do need to decide rather soon what's going to happen, because there is already a large number of private lawsuits looking to recover assets. And the case of Argentina also show that there are private sector legal mechanisms through which some of these assets could be used for private sector debt settlement, even if the governments haven't really taken a decision on it yet. So I think it's urgent that we come up with some sort of procedure for whether this is even possible, and if so, how it might be done. And I think the United Nations remains probably the best forum, because it has the widest legitimacy to determine that sort of a roadmap.
And actually, your
Nicholas,
last sentence. Go ahead.
Please, I just wanted to add to that very briefly. I think what's interesting about the reserves issue is that from a messaging standpoint, the United States in particular, which is using designating central banks and freezing reserves, policymakers still insist that these are targeted measures. But of course, for everyone on this call, we know that if you block the vast majority of a country's foreign exchange reserves, or you designate their central bank, that is a systemic action that will have a significant impact on the targeted economy, even if you are only targeting a discrete set of assets or a discrete institution. So there's a messaging thing here. But the other thing I would mention is that we can consider that it's not simply whether the reserves are frozen or not frozen. And at the moment, the political debate is largely around a binary. There is some sort of precedent for central bank funds to be held in escrow type accounts and for the use of those funds to be permissible for example, humanitarian trade. Such a system existed briefly under the Trump administration for Iran, also under the Obama administration. And I think these kinds of mechanisms are really crucial, and they need to be a normal part of sanctions practice, possibly with the IFI serving as a kind of a steward of these programs to make sure that we are not necessarily, when you place that kind of systemic pressure on a targeted country, if it is necessary to maintain some foreign exchange liquidity to keep humanitarian trade flowing, that those mechanisms are already well defined and they just can be taken off the shelf when the action of the designation or the blocking of assets is taken. At the moment, what tends to happen is the sanction is applied, and then many, many months later, after we see the consequences, after civil society groups point to the humanitarian costs, there is some legal remedy, usually additional guidance or a general license that's being issued by the country that is imposing sanctions to try and mitigate that effect. But it's a very reactive and it's a very insufficient kind of solution for the types of pain points that are being created.
That's excellent. I have one question myself, which tallies with a question that was raised here about the role of the United Nations in the issuing of sanctions by Yongzheng Yang. So asking, should sanctions be regulated by the UN? Of course, the United Nations Security Council can implement sanctions and has done so in the past. But in this particular episode, it's not like that, right, Nicholas? So it's like an alliance of countries, I think led by the United States, the EU, and the G7. So it's quite a different consortium, if you wish. And what are the implications of that for creating a precedent? And this looks more like, it goes more into the war type alliances or pro-peace alliances than the actual UN story. And how do you see this in terms of the history of sanctions? This is a question both of you, of course, and then I think we could close. There are no more questions.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the key thing, right? And that's why this sanctions use right now raises the prospect of maybe bloc formation, because it is precisely the fact that members of the UN Security Council, permanent members, are involved, that have led to the UN being a relative sideshow here. The issue, I think, is that you are moving towards a different kind of configuration, but the frames that I have so far seen being advanced do not really match the realities, because on the one hand, it's presented as a sort of front of democracies, but important democracies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, India, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, etc., are left out of the coalition. So it seems much more of a kind of advanced economy group, or industrial democracies, if you like. And it remains to be seen, right, whether this sort of alliance would be the same if there were other conflicts. So we also don't really know how long-term, how cohesive this group is over the long term, if it would react in the same way if there were other sorts of issues coming up. And this is one of the things reasons why I think Lend-Lease is important to bring out. Even though the United States Congress has just passed an act to support Ukraine that carries that title, that's really very different. Lend-Lease, the rhetoric again, and the reality were very, very different from each other. It was always trumpeted as the arsenal of democracy, but to be a recipient of Lend-Lease, you did not have to be a democracy at all. It was actually a very ideologically agnostic form of aid. You simply had to join a coalition against the Axis powers that was in favor of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, which became the founding principles of the United Nations. Lend-Lease went to the Soviet Union, which was the second largest recipient of Lend-Lease, and it was clearly not Western democracy along those lines. Nationalist China received large amounts, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, etc. So there were many, many countries in it. And I think that that's why the fact that it created the United Nations is so important. It was actually an economic alliance with far fewer political strings attached, and the longevity of what it created was much more substantial. So that's why I think we should think about, collective challenges. And again, it seems to me climate change is one of them, but there could be others in the realm of development. And yeah, thank you.
Well, I could just conclude by thanking you again, both Nicholas and Esfandyar, for this really excellent presentation. I continue to read your work, which has been enlightening for me as an economist. It's always to put things into perspective, but it has a tremendous amount of read acrosses with the current global situation, not just the one now, but actually in the last 50 years. I think my conclusion, what I take from this, is that peace is more important than ever. We can't, respond necessarily with weapons, and to some extent, sanctions are a form of weapon, and they have to be used. Looking at history, what history has started about that. But importantly, I think your discussion and your slides open and pave the way to a reflection for the IMF and everybody else involved about what can they do in the circumstance, what work can they lay to be shovel ready for hopefully very, very soon, when peace will come back, and we'll have to lift the sanctions and move to rebuilding what we had before, and maybe even stronger global economy. So thank you again from the IEO and from everybody who participated, and hopefully let's continue this dialogue, which I think it's very educational and important for us at the IEO, and surely for a lot of colleagues at the IMF. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.